Is there any colonies anywhere left? I mean,
Technically, yeah, I don't know.
I mean, technically, I guess there are some.
Can you see me?
Maybe.
Yep, I can see it, Pratik.
All right, so let's start the debate.
Sure, sounds good.
Puerto Rico.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, please start.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, before I get going, my arguments today won't necessarily reflect my own views. I generally think colonialism is immoral on its face. So, but to create kind of a good discussion, I'll try to document the things that may have been positive outcomes for India from the colonial period. And I guess that's where I'll go with it. Generally speaking, I don't like colonialism. I think people should, nations should have individual sovereignty, and people should self-determine who the rulers are and what systems of government they have. But we'll go ahead. It's pretty interesting history. I didn't know very much of anything about it other than for a long time Britain controlled India and that region of the world. So one of the reasons I took the topic was so that I could learn a little bit about it so I could discuss it effectively. But I'm still no expert, so my knowledge is pretty limited. So anytime I say something dumb, let me know. I was thinking of maybe starting with just sort of a very broad outline for anybody else who doesn't know the general history of it. Does that sound good?
All right, yeah, it sounds good. It was the British started invading India after the Battle of Plassey, when the Nawab of Bengal and the East India Company had a fight. And then after the first war, that is, the East India Company ruled over India for more than 100 years. And then there was this first war of independence in 1857 in India. And there were many revolts in all parts of the country, and then people revolted. And then the transfer of power of the government of India from the company to the crown, and then the Queen Victoria became the first Empress of India. And then the exploitation mainly started. It actually started with invasion of the East India Company. When it started to exploit India, it started to take its wealth. It started to take everything good from India. But when the company moved away and the crown came away, the Queen Victoria became the Empress of India. The conditions were worsened because people already knew what independence was because of few independence leaders, and the conditions worsened because there was this crown and it wanted everything. And the Britain came to one of the richest countries of India, and the world GDP accounting to 27%, and over 200 years of exploitation and depredation reduced India to a poster child of third world poverty. And when they left India, 90% of Indians living under the poverty line, and literacy rate was under 17%, and life expectations below 27%. They were draining the country's resources limitlessly, and the last most thing they did was investing in India's education. Like some people say today that British did a lot for the education of India. The last thing they did was investing in the education of India. An American traveler came to India and he noted down that the total investment of education of the British from the nursery level to the university level, then half the investment of one class in Tokyo as well as in the New York. So all the elite universities which are said to be established by the grace of the British, it was established by the government of India when it was independent. The British, all they did was exploiting India. There were rich temples, they were all taken away by India. India was such a rich country that even some monuments were there where diamonds were embedded in the walls of those monuments, and each diamond was taken by the Britain by just they just wanted every resource of India. They just tried to maintain India as an agricultural colony, a colony which from where they can get enough wealth. And especially after the agrarian and the revolution in England, Britain did all they could to maintain India just an agricultural colony, not working even a single time for the development of India. Though Queen Victoria promised people of India that material wealth, material development of the country would be the personal concern of the Queen, but nothing was obeyed. No promise was fulfilled by the Queen Victoria, and yes, the India was exploited badly, extremely badly, because when they came to India, it was 20. The global GDP of India was 27%, which was probably the highest. And the export and import of India was so high that even the Romans had their discussion, England, American, everyone had their discussions of the Indian goods, of the Indian exports. So, and gradually it came down. The British deliberately crippled the systems of India, the export and import of India. Heavy duties were imposed on goods exported from India, and as India was at the mercy of her foreign masters, all the England goods were pushed at India at a very low cost. So ultimately, this led to the crippling of India. Some people argue that English education was introduced by the British people. So, but what I think is that all the elite universities were established when the government of India was formed, when India became independent, and no ruler of India had any feeling for India except the last ruler, viceroy of India, Lord Mountbatten. So, and moreover, after the Second World War, there were big famines in West Bengal, and there were big riots in West Bengal. But all the money designated for the people of West Bengal for investment in West Bengal, all was taken away, and it was invested in the British Army. So ultimately, they always thought of their welfare, their benefits. They never thought of India. And still the Kohinoor diamond, which belonged to India, is embedded in the Queen's crown. So that's the main problem. Still, when the government of India is pleading them to give back the diamond, they are denying that. So still somewhere we can feel that today the conditions of poverty in India are because of British, because they invaded India and they took all its resources, all its wealth. So ultimately India went down to cripple.
So when we're talking about the wealth at the time, we're talking about productivity during that period, or are you talking about like raw materials and resources?
Basically everything was available in India. Both the raw materials were available in India, huge lands were available, there was farming on a large scale, but everything was taken away by the British. Everything was exported to England. Everything was, all the wealth of India was like many leaders told that all the salaries, all the money, all the salaries, everything was cut from the resources of India. Nothing was taken from the British wealth. And that's why we see Britain today standing as one of the leading countries of the world, and India is comparatively nothing to that. So that's the main reason. And the import and export, as we said, the raw materials were also there, as well as the cotton industries, the silk industries, the cotton industries. Everything was crippled. Everything was crippled in India.
So what kind of country do you think India would have been if it hadn't experienced colonialism from Europe? How do you think their path would diverge?
If the British wouldn't have invaded India, as I said, they came to a country with 27% of the global GDP, which would keep on increasing if the British wouldn't have invaded India. And you can imagine India would have been the leader of the world. It would have been on a greater position than America is. It would have been on a greater position than Britain is, than Russia is, than China is. It would have been one of the richest countries in the world. It would have been one of the most prosperous country in the world with no poverty at all. So
there are many other countries that have been wealthy and then collapsed over the years. I mean, there's no guarantee necessarily, right, that because a nation was once wealthy, that it'll continue to be wealthy. I mean, the United States, during that same period, was a tiny country with very little power and resources at the time, but it grew to become extremely powerful.
But the systems in India was such, because there was all monarchy, there was this wealth. As I said, in the monuments there were diamonds embedded, but everything was taken by India, and it was going on increasing. The monarchy system, the tax collecting system was absolutely well, and the main thing, they created the Hindu-Muslim dispute in India that even led to the partition of India, and still we are suffering because of that. And British are said to be the main reason for the divide and rule policy. They followed the divide and rule policy, and they just tried to create a rift between the Hindus and the Muslims, the two main religions in India, and they tried to rule. And they thought it the most easy way to rule.
But there were certainly conflicts between Muslims and Hindus before that. I mean, the Mughal Empire, the Mughal Empire, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, was a Muslim empire that was that ruled large portions of India for quite some time. They collapsed, and the Maratha Empire rose up in its place, which was a Hindu empire that conquered and took over the old Mughal territory. They're the ones that built Taj Mahal, that sort of thing. But by the time that the European traders arrived, my understanding was that the Maratha Empire was in a state of decline, was largely seen as having a lot of corruption and elitism, where very kind of a typical feudal society where those who owned the land grants were very wealthy, had a lot of money and riches, but the serfs who worked under them were not especially in good shape. And it was there was a lot of division and rivalry and conflict at the time when the British arrived. And the East India Company, one of the reasons they came to power was by exploiting those differences and picking the people that they would support to take over. And in the end, they ended up with mostly proxies ruling the country at that time.
All right, you see, this was whatever the fight was going on. This was not the fight between the Hindus and the Muslims. The Maratha Empire tried to conquer over the Mughal Empire, not because they were the Hindus and they were the Muslims, because there was a race for empire. There was in the Maratha Empire too. There were the general of the empire, the general of the army was a Muslim in the Maratha Empire. So there's no question of conflict between Hindus and the Muslims. There was just a conflict of empires, that I want to win over vast empire. I want to own a vast empire. So that was the main conflict. And regarding the Mughal rulers, yes, Mughal rulers have this concept of this religious thing. They imposed the jizya tax on the Hindus, but still the conflicts are not to a high scale. When it came to a high scale when the British invaded India. They started spreading myths, they started spreading lies, and there were these hostilities between the Hindus and the Muslims. Because in the times of Mughal Empire, we see, suppose Jahangir was a Mughal ruler, he hated Hindus, he imposed a jizya tax, but never do we heard that there were riots. Never do we heard that a Muslim murdered a Hindu and in return a Hindu murdered two Muslims. That was never the case. But when the British invaded India, they started spreading myths and lies. This was the case, that a Hindu is murdering a Muslim is murdering two Hindus. So this was going on in the British Empire. And the Mughal rulers, yes, of course, some Mughal rulers had a hate for the Hindus, like Akbar the Great. He didn't have a hate for the Hindus. He abolished the jizya tax. He worked for the welfare of India. And then too, there was more than the Hindu-Muslim question. There was this question of expanding the empire. There was this question of how to gain popularity, how to expand the empire. Because I see that Aurangzeb, whom we say that he hated the Hindus most, he told his general of the army to go to temples. His general of the army was Hindu. So there's no question of Hindu-Muslim. But when the British invaded India, this question of Hindu-Muslim started to arise. They spread myths. They told the Muslims that they were very good. Somewhere they told the Hindus that they were to a high position 200 years ago. Somewhere they told the Muslims that they ruled India for 200 years ago. So India belongs to them. And then they went to the Hindus and told the same thing. So there was this conflict amongst the Hindus and the Muslims of who was greater. So after the War of Independence, we see to follow the policy of divide and rule, the Muslims were removed from the main life of India. They tried to scatter all the Muslims from the main life of India and try to include in the Hindus, try to bring Hindus in confidence. And then after the first War of Independence, this happened. And after about 50 years, they removed the Hindus from their eyes of honor and they included Muslims in the eyes of honors. So this was the rift they wanted to create so that they can rule independently, because they saw that the Hindus and the Muslims both were combining against the British. And they watched this thing with a high sense of alarm. So they thought that this should not happen, and they tried to increase the hostilities. And I consider one of the main reasons of the one of the main reasons of partition of India into India and Pakistan to be the British Empire, because ultimately they sowed the seed of the conflict between the Hindus and the Muslims. So today India's partition was also because of the British. So it was pre-planned.
The partition was chosen by the Muslim groups, right? That's my understanding, is that by the time of the partition, a lot of the Muslim factions wanted an independent country. The main part of the Indian legislature was against it. They wanted a more secular state that wasn't explicitly declared Muslim or Hindu, but the Muslims were pretty adamant about having their own, and so in the end, that's the way it ended up. So they got Pakistan, which included Bangladesh at the time, and then later that became independent. But you're saying so I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I agree. Definitely the case. Colonial powers will divide and rule, and they'll sow the seeds of dissent. But it wasn't the case necessarily that the two sides were in. I mean, as you said, there were conflicts before. I mean, that did exist, and there in many countries we see there aren't. I don't know if there's a lot of other Hindu majority countries in the world or in that region, but certainly in some Muslim majority countries, there's a relative lack of acceptance of other religious views taking place within those countries, right? They tend to want to have an exclusive religious state in most Muslim nations. There are exceptions, but.
First of all, as you said, the Muslims in India wanted a separate secular state for themselves. This was also a planned move of the British, because they initially had their ears. They told the Muslims that at that time the Congress Party was said to have the power after the British went away. So the British at that time too were very like they wanted anyhow to exploit India at that time too. So they said to the Muslims that you cannot expect any justice in the hands of Congress leaders, because they will always bring Hindus into confidence. So that motivated the Muslims to bring up a separate state for themselves. So that was the main reason why the Muslims were more considerate of Pakistan, because they thought that if Pakistan was formed, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was the leader of the Muslim League, would rule Pakistan, and Muslims would expect justice in the hands of the League. So that's what the British poured into the Muslim ears. So that was the main reason of partition of India. That too.
Do you think Britain was in? Do you think Britain was in control of that process, or had lost control by that point? I mean, but for Britain, do you think it would have been a unified country?
Pardon, last sentence.
But for Britain, do you think India would have been unified as one country?
Yes, I think that if Britain wouldn't have been there, of course, India would have been unified into one country. But honestly speaking, there were many monarchy kingdoms inside India when the British invaded India. Like there was this Mughal kingdom. They had a large sect. They had this Maratha kingdom. They had in Jammu and Kashmir, they had a separate kingdom. Many kings were there. India wouldn't have unified into one state. I cannot assure that India would have been unified into one state. But of course, India would have been more prosperous if Britain wouldn't have invaded India. And moreover, when this partition thing happened, the Muslims and the Hindu riots went to such a peak. The Hindus and the Muslim riots went to such a peak point that it wasn't under the control of the British, because they just wanted a dispute among the Hindus and the Muslims, and they were successful in implementing that. So that's when they left the Britain left India, they left India in a complete uncontrolled condition. It was not at all controlled, and the government of the two countries, India and Pakistan, had to do a lot for bringing matters under control. And of course, many were killed. It was one of the it was in the human history, it was one of the greatest migrating craze, that millions migrated from India to Pakistan and Pakistan to India, and millions were killed, all by the grace of Britain.
Although again, it wasn't necessarily Britain that mandated that they be split into two.
Of course, the British assured that they would split to two. When Lord Mountbatten came to India, and he was actually the first viceroy who considered India to be a country, who considered India to be which could be a prosperous country. He was the first viceroy, and no other viceroy which came to India thought that India could be a prosperous country. They all looked down to the people of India. They all thought the people of India to be, say, illiterate, and they couldn't have any political aspiration. They looked down upon the people of India. And Lord Mountbatten came to India, and he realized that Winston Churchill, who was then the Prime Minister of Britain, he had already decided that partition would have been there before the thing of the partition. So the Britain already knew that in such a condition it will lead to partition. So they always tried, they tried to implement things that fixed that partition would happen.
Do you think if Britain had suggested that there be no partition, that the Muslim factions would have peacefully allowed that and not tried to claim independence?
Of course, the partition wouldn't have been there if the British didn't pour myths in the ears of the Muslims, because they constantly went on poking the Muslims that they wouldn't expect any justice in the hands of the Congress. They wouldn't expect any fairness in the hands of Congress. The Congress would always look after the Hindus, and they would never consider Muslims as anything. They constantly, at every instance, we find this thing, and constantly they went about provoking the Hindus and the Muslims to fight. Suppose, for instance, there was this Muslim League in Lucknow. In Lucknow, there was this language Urdu. Every documentation was done in Urdu. The British, to try to invoke the Muslims there to fight, by converting the official language from Urdu to Hindi, so that it could bring Hindus to the conference and remove Muslims from the conference. This again raised a riot. There was no need of converting this, because people were comfortable with the Urdu language. Many of those who resided in Lucknow practiced Urdu language, and they mastered Urdu language, and this hurt the sentiments of the Muslims. Second instance is in the history books that were taught, the history books that were issued in India. It was written that the Muslims ruled India for 200 years by the Mughal period in Delhi Sultanate, and they exploited the Hindus. They did this to Hindus. They harmed Hindus. They imposed tax on the Hindus. This also again increased the hostilities between the Muslims and the Hindus. And again, in the history books too, when they instructed such thing, the Hindus were again at the peak point, and they said that no, we were the rulers before the Muslims over 2,500 years. And then again this fight was provoked. So initially, when the East India Company came to India, they started the process of dividing the people of India on the basis of religion. They started as soon as they stepped into the country. So of course, in that conditions, it was very obvious that partition would happen. The Muslims would demand a separate country. And at the peak point, when the British were convinced that the transfer of power is necessary, then again they started this Hindu-Muslim conflict. Say everywhere there was riots, everywhere there were rumors, everywhere there were conflicts between the Hindus and the Muslims, and that was the main goal of the British. And yeah, I think that if the British wouldn't have invaded India, of course, conditions would have been better, and India and Pakistan would have been one unified state, India.
Were the British usually involved in putting down these riots?
No, British actually didn't try to put down these riots. They tried to more increase the riot. As I said, Lord Mountbatten had a feeling for India. Only he was the viceroy who went down to the streets of India and tried to convince people that they are one unified state. They can be into one unified state, but till then the hostilities were such that they couldn't agree to be in one unified state. And there were many riots. There were unlimited riots in India. in among the Hindus and the Muslims. It was in the West Bengal, it was in Delhi, it was in Mumbai. Everywhere there were riots, and the British did nothing to control India, to control these riots.
So we usually think of riots as like citizens rising up against the whoever's in power at the time, like whoever the governor is, is that the case, or are these like sort of like race riots where people are rising up and attacking their neighbors?
No, it was more for the Hindus and the Muslims. It was nothing regarding the administrative system, because they issued such conditions that no one could think of what our administrative setup is. Everyone thought of how to get rid of the opposite religion, the Muslims, or the Muslims thought how to get rid of Hindus, and the Hindus thought how to get rid of Muslims. So no one's attention went out to the independence of our country.
So
they created such conditions.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to bring up is the legacy of the British legal system. So when partly during the East India Company, and then later as Britain came over, the administration in India, while it was a hybrid system, there were local rulers that were sort of delegated to. The British did start to institute British-style law court systems. That sort of structure, which is still there today, right? I mean, established parliamentary systems and legal bodies of law, common law based on British law, that are still part of the Indian system today, independent of the economic system, which we can talk about a little later. Do you think that ultimately, British law and governmental systems were a beneficial change compared to the systems of the Maratha or Mughal empires previously?
What I see, my personal notice in Indian history, is that the British, when they invaded India, before that, the Mughal rulers were there, and they were they preferred justice. They always wanted justice in India, and the rulers were never such that they denied justice to anyone. If we read the history of India, we very rarely find such cases where justice was not provided by the monarchs or the kings or the queen. So justice, the Indian kings were they love justice.
Most kings love justice, right? I mean, there were not a lot of the. I mean, if you look at detail, not a lot of monarchies around the world are not corrupt to some degree, or justice is meted out to their friends, and not so much to their enemies, right? As where the Magna Carta, I mean, it really, England is the kind of the heartland of the idea that there's a body of law that even the rulers of the country must obey, right, for the good of the people and the body politic.
If England was a body of law, there was a Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Have you heard of it?
Mm-hmm.
The Jallianwala Bagh massacre.
I'm not saying that England has always been just by any stretch of the imagination, right? I'm looking for legacies of the colonialism that, my part in here is I'm trying to find benefits. Maybe not net, but in the long run, the government system that India has and the body of law that India has, which is generally considered to be pretty good, and up to world standards for the most part, came from that colonial period and from the British.
So these parliamentary system, whatever you like, what you were talking about, these parliamentary system were not needed specifically in India if the British didn't invade, because people were happy from the monarchs. People were never sad because of
monarchies that have survived into the 20th century. They're pretty much all gone, except for very small states.
Gradually, what I think that gradually, if the change would have been in the world, there would have been a change in India. That's a separate topic, because you see, if the monarchs in India would have seen the world changing, a democratic system being issued, a democratic system being started, gradually there would have been a change in India. Who knows that specific king or certain king of a huge empire would have started a democracy system, or maybe anything could happen. So
right, well, that's the thing. I mean, it could have descended into feudal conflict and a slow decay, or conquered by its neighbors over time Turkey and China and other nations could have gobbled up pieces of it if it was divided and weak during that period.
The Indian kingdoms, the kingdoms in India were extremely strong. The Mughal Empire, you see, it went till Afghanistan. It didn't only limit to India. It crossed Indian borders. It went till Afghanistan, and parts of China were also said to be conquered by Mughal emperors. Every empire which came, it went on expanding. Like Delhi Sultanate went up to China. The Mughal Empire went up to Afghanistan. So the empire of India gradually started spreading. So what does this mean? This implies that the Indian kings were not at all weak. They were absolutely strong, because when this ruler called, I'm forgetting the Greek ruler's name, who tried to invade India. That was Alexander the Great. Yeah, Alexander the Great. He tried to invade India, but he couldn't cross the Indian borders. He tried to cross the Indian borders, but he had to retreat because of his sickness. That's a different issue. But he also made a comment that the Indian system of management, the Indian kingdoms were extremely strong. So
why do you think they fell? Why do you think they fell to the East India Company then? I mean, it's a trading company. While it did have military forces, it wasn't exactly a military power.
East India Company, as I said initially, that they started with the Battle of Plassey. When the Battle of Plassey was happening, the East India Company tried to, it was a war between the East India Company and the Nawabs of Bengal. So Nawabs of Bengal, the leader of the army, his name was Mir Zafar. Mir Zafar was corrupt, and he went and he was paid by the East India Company, and he was brought to his side, and that was the main reason why East India Company invaded in India. So if they wouldn't have, the Mir Zafar wouldn't have been corrupt. He wouldn't have taken money from the people of from the East India Company. Then probably the East India Company could never defeat the Nawab Kingdom of Bengal. So that became the main. Pardon?
They were essentially bribed, defeated by bribes and financial incentives.
Yeah. So yeah, he was bribed, and Mir Zafar was told that he would become the next ruler of Bengal if he came to the side of the East India Company. So that's why he was bribed, and that became the main cause of the collapse of the Nawab. So there the East India Company started, and there it held its grip. And after a few months, Mir Zafar was, of course, made the Nawab of Bengal, and after a few months, he was also removed from the post of the Nawab of Bengal. And then East India started to hold its grip over Bengal, and that's why the capital of Britain, British India became Calcutta, where I live. So that's the main initial incoming of the East India Company to India was through Bengal, and they held their grips in Bengal, and then they went on defeating every ruler.
Yeah, I guess to me there's a dichotomy between the idea that the Indian state at the time was extremely strong and that they fell to the East India Company relatively easily. It seems to either say that there was a serious weakness within the Indian state at the time, or the East India Company was exceptionally powerful. But that, sort of the storyline is the East India Company kind of snuck their way in there, but then steamrolled everybody. And it seems contradictory to the idea that the state at the time was strong and well-developed and powerful.
Look, the East India Company, as I said, when they came to India, they had a very weak army. But the Bengal army, where it was the first to sit down in the Bengal, so Bengal army was an extremely powerful army. So because of bribery to Mir Zafar, first of all, because of bribery, not because of victory over Bengal, because of bribery, they won over Bengal. And Bengal army was one of the, largest army of India. Yeah. So combining their armies with the Bengal army, they started to conquer the whole of India.
But at that point, isn't it really like the ruling powers of India choosing to be allies of the East India Company at that point? And choosing them as their
yeah, they didn't want the East India Company to rule over India. They wanted to have trade relations with the East India Company. They never knew that one day East India Company would totally conquer over India, and they would exploit India. They thought to have a trade relation with the East India Company, so that the status of the empire went on increasing, because East India Company was a great trading company. So that's the main reason that
Okay.
they allowed the East India Company to settle down in India.
So let me present a few of the economic arguments that I read about online, and you can counter them. So, you talked a little bit about the exploitation, and obviously the East India Company and Britain were interested in trade exploitation. That's pretty much the whole reason they were out in that part of the world. But some of the things that they mentioned that they did for India are industrialization efforts to set up steel industry in India, and during the Industrial Revolution to bring automation and factories to India. The extensive railway system, they built about the 4th largest railway system in the world at the time on the Indian continent, which is still in use today. Irrigation infrastructure, the largest irrigation system in the world at that point, they put together. They had a lower tax rate. By the time the British left, there was around a 1% tax rate, and I'm told when they took over, the Maratha Empire had about a 13% tax rate that they had been levied. And they introduced smallpox vaccination, other sanitation efforts, at least in some of the cities, that increased doubled the mortality rates at the time, which led to its own set of problems because the population increased dramatically during that time because of those health changes. While there were a number of famines and starvations that took place during the British Raj, each time they made various efforts to try and improve the agricultural system, to increase food production, and enable more people to eat. So those are the claims, right? That the development that took place during that period.
Okay, so contradictory to all you said, by the way, where did you read all this?
Wikipedia, of course. It's good for summary of information. I only had a day, so.
Whatever Wikipedia has said, the industrial thing, they issued many industries in India. All they did for themselves, because no product of the industries, no productivity of the industries, the industries, whatever the industries used to produce, everything was taken away by the British. India was just reduced to an agricultural colony. The agricultural reforms they introduced, whatever they did for agriculture, that was because of themselves. Every little thing that was produced in India was taken by the British, and that too imposing heavy duties in that. And you said about natality rate. When Britain left India, the life expectancy was below 27%. So that's what they did for the natality rate. And sanitization, oh my gosh, the famines that came, the issue that hit the West Bengal, the south of India, the southern part of India, everything they did was to cut down the resources of West Bengal. When the famine occurred, to cut down the resources of West Bengal more and more, because it occurred during the Second World War, and they wanted the money for the armies of Britain. So whatever according to the reports of Winston Churchill, whatever were the resources designated for West Bengal at the time of famine, they were reduced much, and every resource was taken for investment in the in the British Army. So actually, and when the famine hit in South India, as a mockery, there was an imperial darbar held in the northern part of India as a mockery to the illiterate people of South India at the time when they were suffering from famine. So this is what the British did to India. They mocked the people, and when they needed the resources much, they cut down the resources more and invested in the British Army. Winston Churchill said that India couldn't have a political aspiration. Those people are illiterates. Those people are deserving to be just servants. And Winston Churchill went to that extent, and he partly abused Mahatma Gandhi, the leader of India, the independent leader of India who wanted independence for India. He abused him, and they always considered people of India to be servants. They never considered people of India to be people, and they treated people in such a way that the British people could even kill India at their will. The British police could arrest Indians at their will. There was no need of warrant in India, and the natality rate, of course, went down, and agricultural things, of course, went down, because the main states to produce the export crops were Bengal, Uttar Pradesh, and certain parts of South India, and everything they produced was taken away to Britain, and that too imposing heavy duties in that. So and the most important thing, the English goods, and that too not very rich goods, but very inferior quality goods were pushed upon India at very high costs, and India eventually had to take those goods because it had no other choices. If it tried to export to any other countries, heavy duties imposed on that. But these deliberately crippled the system, the economic system of India, the industrial system of India, the cottage industries, everything of India was crippled. They liked silk so much.
But those were all developed during the British Raj. I mean, the British were in charge of India during the entirety of pretty much the Industrial Revolution. So there were no industries prior to that period.
It absolutely didn't develop during the British Raj. It was more crippled. Every history record tells that it was more crippled. Else, India would have been the largest exporter of the world in every terms, because we see today everything was taken away by Britain. Every little thing, the cotton industries, the rich cotton produced here, the rich silk produced here. Today, silk industry is declining in India because of Britain. It was practiced on a large scale when Britain didn't invade India. When they invaded India, it absolutely collapsed because of the heavy duties, because of massive killing of the farmers, the indigo planting. It didn't because the indigo is such a crop that once it is planted in one land, no crop can be planted in that piece of land forever, because it releases certain acids in the soil. So the British forced the people of India, the farmers of India, to grow indigo in their pieces of land. So that made the lands too infertile. So these little measures in the fields of agriculture, in the fields of industries, these absolutely crippled everything in India. And of course, before they invaded India, it was 27% of India contributed to 27% of global GDP, and today where it stands to nearly 7 or 9%. So gradual decrease.
They didn't really measure things like GDP during the early 18th century, right? I mean, there wasn't international statistics on, consistent currency measurements. That's a pretty broad estimate.
The historian.
I want to bring up one last subject. We've only got about a minute 30 here, which is that India participated in World War I and World War II on the same side as the British, as you noted. They put in troops, and they also supplied a great deal of ammunition during World War II. They were large producers of ammunition at the time. And the outcome, of course, is they were part of the Allies, so they were on the winning side of both of those conflicts. And in the post-World War II world, India remained part of the Commonwealth, an ally with Britain and Australia and Canada, and part of the general Western alliance, and went into the 20th century as part of the dominant economic and military bloc in the world, and has remained a willing partner in those alliances and in that participation during that time. If there was such animosity, why did they continue to be a part of that political unity?
Okay, so very hastily, the Indian troops were given to the Allied powers under the pressure of the British. The British Indian troops, they were under the complete control of Britain, so they were supplied into the side of Allies in the first and Second World War. And after that too, the India tried to remain in the Commonwealth because it had no other option. Germany, Japan, every Axis powers, they had already collapsed. They had no power at all, and India was in such a condition that it had to develop constantly because they left India absolutely undeveloped. So it had to develop, and that's why it took the side of the Commonwealth. It took the side of developing nations so that it can develop a bit. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for the debate. It's very educational for me. Much appreciated.